Edwin Valero didn't just die. He was ruled a suicide in a jail cell. Case closed. But if you follow the trail, nothing about that night feels accidental. Here's why. The clock starts ticking on March 25th, 2010. In just 24 days, an undefeated national hero becomes Venezuela's most infamous headline, and less than 24 hours later, he's dead under police watch. What changed between midnight and morning? And who had something to lose if Valero kept talking? To answer those questions, you have to see how Valero became boxing's most feared knockout machine, and the warning signs that followed him. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear makes that official ruling a lot harder to believe. Valero's rise through boxing felt like something out of a movie. Undefeated, unstoppable, he climbed into the ring 27 times and left 27 stunned opponents knocked out cold. His story begins in Venezuela, in the rough neighborhoods around Valencia, where his fiery nature found its outlet inside a boxing gym. From a young age, he was known for his intensity, the kind of raw aggression that couldn't be ignored. By the time he turned pro, it wasn't just local trainers who were talking. Everyone who saw him fight believed they were watching one of the most dangerous prospects in the sport. He wasn't just another fighter trying to make a name. He carried himself like a storm that had already decided what it would destroy. When he officially turned professional in 2002, Valero wasted no time showing the boxing world what he was about. In his debut, he flattened his opponent in under 3 minutes. A glimpse of what was to come. Many of his early fights didn't even make it past the first round. In fact, his first 17 professional bouts all ended before the bell for round 2. Imagine that 17 straight highlight reel knockouts before anyone could even test him. Fans and commentators couldn't help comparing him to Mike Tyson's early run. It wasn't just that he hit hard, it was how sudden and violent his fights ended. Blink, and it was over. But then came 2006, the night that would define him as more than just a knockout artist. He traveled to Panama to fight Vicente Mosquera for the WBA super featherweight title. For the first time, Valero had to go into deeper waters. In round 3, Mosquera floored him, and for a split second, it looked like the aura might break. But instead of folding, Valero came back even more ferocious. He absorbed punishment, pressed forward, and by the 10th round, forced the stoppage. That fight didn't just give him a title, it proved he had more than explosive power. He had resilience, grit, and that frightening willingness to absorb damage, just to give it back tenfold. Inside the ring, Valero was unpredictable and relentless. As a southpaw, he came forward throwing with bad intentions from the opening second, often battering opponents' arms until they physically couldn't raise their guard anymore. Sparring was brutal too. Guys who worked with him said it was less about practice and more about survival. He didn't pull punches, didn't ease up. He'd tag you until your legs turned to jelly. For most fighters, there's a wall between training and fighting. For Valero, there wasn't. Every punch meant harm, every session a war. It wasn't just the violence that made him stand out, though it was the persona. He knew how to sell the image of being Venezuela's warrior. Across his chest, he tattooed Hugo Chavez alongside the Venezuelan flag, tying his identity directly to both his nation and its controversial leader. For Venezuelans who admired Chavez, Valero was a source of pride. Proof that their country could produce a world-class, undefeated destroyer. But for others, especially outside Venezuela, that political allegiance made him harder to market. Aligning himself so loudly with Chavez created doors in Latin America while shutting plenty in the U.S. Still, Valero didn't care. The fame, the recognition, he embraced it all. His dominance continued into the lightweight division. In April 2009, he fought Antonio Pitalua in Austin, Texas, for the vacant WBC lightweight belt. That night he blasted through Pitalua in 2 rounds, finally putting his name on the radar of American fans watching on a bigger stage. Less than a year later, on February 6, 2010, he defended the same title against Antonio DeMarco. Early in the fight, DeMarco's elbow split Valero's forehead wide open, blood pouring out. But Valero never slowed down. He marched forward, applying relentless pressure until DeMarco's corner stopped the fight in the 9th. Covered in blood yet still attacking with the same unforgiving pace, Valero's reputation as an unstoppable force was cemented. To Venezuelan fans, he wasn't just a boxer anymore. He became a national idol, the embodiment of their pride and defiance. But fame brought more than just cheers and applause. Even during his prime, people close to him noticed things that didn't fit neatly into the narrative of a champion. Sparring outbursts, angry confrontations, and a short fuse that never seemed to switch off outside the ropes. Sparring partners spoke about how training sessions with Valero would often spiral into heated confrontations, where he'd throw punches that had nothing to do with technique or drills. It wasn't training with him, it was survival. Trainers described his attitude as weaponized aggression, saying that he didn't just fight opponents, he fought everyone and everything around him, even if the situation didn't call for it. That volatility started surfacing outside the gym, too. There were incidents, fights, and stories about his behavior trickling into the press, each one hinting at something unstable lurking beneath the surface. Yet most of it was brushed aside. Fans loved the chaos, the rawness of someone who seemed completely unfiltered. In boxing, sometimes the flaws are even more exciting than the perfection. Valero leaned into that idea and wore his madness like another badge of honor. By the time he reached 27-0, every single victory by knockout, it wasn't just about wins and losses anymore. He wasn't seen as a man you could argue he was closer to a myth. The perfect KO record, the warrior image, and his political connections all blended into something larger than boxing. To the public, Valero looked untouchable. But what the fans celebrated as intensity and fearlessness might just have been symptoms of a storm already building inside him. Because if you looked closely, some of the cracks were already there. He fought like a man who didn't care about consequences, who didn't fear what the next punch would do to him or anyone else. And when a fighter's violence in the ring doesn't switch off outside of it, you have to wonder what comes next. It turns out, the beginning of the answer was tied to an event years earlier. Long before he ever strapped on a world title belt, something that left a mark on him that he carried into every fight afterward. On February 5, 2001, everything shifted for Edwin Valero. At just 19 years old, the rising fighter born and raised in Valencia was riding a motorcycle through Mérida without a helmet when he lost control and crashed. The impact fractured his skull and left him with a cerebral hemorrhage so severe that surgeons had to perform emergency surgery to remove a blood clot and save his life. When he left the hospital, he carried with him not only the scar of the operation, but also a metal plate embedded in his head. He recovered, but he would never truly be the same. For most athletes, an accident like that would have been the end. A fractured skull, brain surgery, and lasting neurological trauma aren't exactly the recipe for a comeback. But Valero wasn't built like most people, and he refused to let anyone write the story for him. Within months, he was back in the gym, training as though the crash hadn't nearly killed him. Coaches and promoters were shocked at how quickly he rebounded. Instead of viewing the injury as a red flag, many in his circle admired his toughness. his ability to walk out of a hospital with a plate in his head and climb back into the ring. The question of what that crash might have done to his brain was brushed aside, buried under highlight reel knockouts and the growing myth of Edwin Valero. The issue returned, though, in January 2004. Valero was rising in the professional ranks and sought to fight in the United States. But when he underwent an MRI scan, regulators discovered brain irregularities. American commissions ruled it unsafe for him to fight, denying him a license on medical grounds. It was a clear sign that the motorcycle crash had left behind more than just a scar. Yet Valero never accepted that explanation. In public, he claimed it was politics, not health, that kept him out of U.S. rings. He pointed to his outspoken support of Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez and suggested American officials didn't want a Chavez loyalist showcasing his talents on their stage. His tattoo of Chavez across his chest made that argument even louder. For fans back home, the narrative fit neatly. Their champion was a victim of political discrimination. But regulators weren't swayed. To them, it wasn't about politics. It was about the risk of putting a fighter with documented brain trauma back into the ring. Unable to fight in the boxing capital of the world, Valero went wherever doors were still open. Japan gave him a stage early in his career, embracing his violent, all-action style. Latin America welcomed him too, offering arenas and title fights without the same level of medical scrutiny. To the outside, it looked like the crash was just a small detour, easily overcome by his natural power and sheer will. But the truth was more complicated. His ban in the U.S. not only cost him exposure in the sport's richest market, it also denied him access to the level of medical monitoring and support that other big-name fighters were routinely given. Where America saw signs of danger, elsewhere saw entertainment and profit. And Valero, desperate to keep fighting, was more than happy to meet them halfway. That combination, lingering trauma, constant head blows, and looser oversight, became a dangerous cocktail. Doctors and commentators later suggested that the damage caused by the motorcycle crash, along with the repeated headshots absorbed during his fights, might have fueled changes in his behavior. Impulsivity, mood swings, explosive aggression. Traits that fans applauded inside the ring didn't always stay inside it. Still, at the time, conversations around brain injuries and fighters' long-term health weren't what they are today. The medical red flags existed, but boxing as a business wasn't paying much attention. Valero himself seemed to embrace the danger. He carried himself as though the metal plate in his skull was proof of indestructibility, not vulnerability. Each knockout win appeared to validate that mindset. Reporters saw it. Trainers saw it. Fans saw it. Everyone stood in awe of his resilience, as if overcoming brain surgery at 19 made him mythic rather than mortal. The injuries faded into the background of his public story, a footnote in the rise of Venezuela's great boxing idol. Keep this in mind, because the fact remained. The motorcycle crash left a permanent shadow over his life. And when, years later, warning signs about his behavior began surfacing, from erratic outbursts to troubling allegations, those who knew his history couldn't help but wonder if the 2001 accident was part of the story. Nobody could say for certain, but enough evidence mounted to suggest that the crash may have reset the trajectory of his life in ways no amount of championship belts could disguise. It's important to note that Valero wasn't just fighting opponents after that day in Mérida. He was also fighting against the system that doubted whether he was even safe to fight at all. Shunned by American commissions, he leaned harder into his political ties. He waved the Venezuelan flag with Chávez's face inked on his chest, loudly framing himself as a warrior for his country. a man unfairly punished because of his beliefs. While that narrative helped build his fan base at home, it masked the more critical reality. He was now competing in regions where the oversight was lighter and the warning signs easier to dismiss. His career path was shaped as much by that motorcycle crash as it was by his fists. As he rose higher, everyone focused on the winning streak and the knockout power. Not the lingering scar tissue, but the crash never stopped being part of his story. It was an invisible weight, pressing down quietly as he racked up victories. And as we move closer to 2010, that weight seems harder and harder to separate from the chain of events about to unfold. This single accident in 2001 closed the gates of the American boxing world and set him on a different course, one that kept him fighting, but also kept him unmonitored, unprotected, and more vulnerable than anyone dared admit. And it wasn't only his career it would affect. The warning signs that emerged years later raised a darker question. If Valero showed this kind of recklessness in the ring, what would happen when that same intensity followed him home? Because the real danger wasn't just in the arena anymore. It was beginning to surface behind closed doors. Home was where the earliest signs of Edwin Valero's decline revealed themselves. By 2009, the same aggression that made him a feared figure in the ring had begun spilling into his private life. That September, reports surfaced of an explosive confrontation at his family home in Valencia. According to accounts, Valero allegedly struck both his mother and sister during a heated dispute. Neighbors said they heard shouting and called the police, and some reports claimed he was briefly arrested. But instead of leading to accountability, the matter seemed to vanish into smoke. Valero flatly denied the allegations, and his mother went so far as to publicly defend him, dismissing the claims as nothing more than an attack on her son's reputation. What should have been a red flag instead became a lesson in evasion. Deny, deflect, and move on. This pattern, family protection and public denial, would repeat itself in ways that proved devastating. Then came March 25, 2010. This wasn't a whisper of trouble. It was a crisis that refused to be hidden. From this point on, the story became a countdown measured in days, each one pushing Valero closer to the breaking point. The timeline runs tight, from March 25, 2010, when his wife was hospitalized, to April 18, when the tragedy inside a Valencia hotel shocked the country. Just 24 days, a series of decisions, failures, and missed chances that now read like milestones on the road to disaster. Day 0, March 25. Jennifer Carolina Vieira, Valero's wife, arrived at a Valencia hospital with broken ribs and a punctured lung. Medical staff had seen her before, but this time the damage was severe. Each visit fit the same pattern. Each visit raised the same unspoken fear. For Jennifer, this hospitalization was not an isolated accident. It was just the latest entry in a cycle of violence nobody managed to stop. Valero dismissed it all as an accident, telling anyone who'd listen that she had simply fallen down a staircase. But the evidence told a different story. The chaos of that night only worsened once Valero arrived at the hospital. Instead of showing concern for his wife, witnesses said he lashed out at the very people working to save her. He allegedly threatened doctors and nurses, stormed through the ward with explosive hostility, and created such fear among the staff that police had to be summoned to control him. It was a public glimpse of just how dangerous and uncontrollable he had become. Not the charismatic knockout artist standing in the ring, but a man unraveling in front of strangers, blind to the destruction trailing behind him. Authorities did step in, at least on paper. That same night, prosecutors pushed for him to be jailed. But a judge chose another route. On March 26, The court instead imposed a restraining order and ordered Valero into 6 months of psychiatric rehabilitation. On paper, it looked like action. In reality, the clock had already begun ticking. Day 9. Instead of 6 months, Valero spent just 9 days in a psychiatric ward. Doctors discharged him, despite his unpredictable behavior, with no signs he'd gotten the treatment he needed. That restraining order meant to protect Jennifer? Valero ignored it almost immediately, confronting her again without consequence. Friends and family described him as erratic, sleepless, his eyes bloodshot, and his temper always on edge. Rather than pull him back, his release set him free to spiral further. The illusion of control by the legal system fell apart in barely more than a week. At every turn, what could have been a decisive intervention became another shrug. Another missed chance. The sequence was simple but damning. Prosecutors asked for jail. A judge opted for leniency. Valero walked free, and the cycle of abuse rolled on. What explains this lenience? The answer lies in who Valero had become outside the ropes. He wasn't just a fighter with a spotless record. He was a national hero, a walking emblem of Venezuelan pride. For many, he embodied their country's ferocious spirit. A champion who carried Chávez's Venezuela onto the global stage. And for political leaders, Valero's public loyalty to Hugo Chávez made him more than an athlete. He was a poster image for national strength. Shielding him from scandal meant protecting both a prized sports star and a political ally. So each incident was brushed aside, each outburst reframed as exaggeration, jealousy, or a vendetta against a beloved champion. The state even tried to repackage his troubles into something that looked like help. After the March 25 incident, officials designed a plan to send him to Cuba for a government-managed drug and alcohol rehabilitation program. On the surface, it looked like intervention, an attempt to help a troubled champion regain stability. In reality, it appeared more like a protective measure for his image than an attempt to face the heart of his violent behavior. Whatever the intent, there was no follow-up. The plan hung in the air, yet Valero remained where he'd always been untouchable, surrounded by enablers, and without accountability. As the days slipped by, those closest to him began sounding alarms. His manager described him as hollow-eyed, endlessly irritable, and consumed by restless energy. Training camps no longer looked like preparation for big fights. They looked like a man pacing inside his own storm. Friends noticed the changes too. Valero ate little, slept less, and seemed unable to sit still. The traits that once defined him as a fighter, energy, intensity, relentlessness, were now rearing up as symptoms of something coming undone. And behind closed doors, Jennifer's bruises and fear told the rest of the story. Despite her visible injuries, despite his escalating paranoia and violence, Valero walked away from the hospital without facing the kind of consequences that might have saved his life, or hers. Day 14. By the second week of April, Valero's behavior grew more unpredictable. He appeared in public as though nothing was wrong, greeting fans who still cheered for their undefeated champion. But at home, reports circulated of severe confrontations. Jennifer's family attempted to intervene, worried for her safety, but their efforts went nowhere. The restraining order meant little without enforcement. To the authorities, he was still a national figure, shielded by both political connections and his aura of indestructibility. On the surface, he was smiling in photos, tattooed with Chávez's face as a symbol of national pride. Beneath that veneer was a man sleep-deprived, paranoid, and losing control. Each week after March 25 chipped away at illusions that he could recover. The hospital outburst showed him as dangerous in public. The psychiatric release proved the system had no appetite to keep him contained. The Cuba program emphasized how politics shaped his treatment or lack of it. By mid-April, the warning signs converged into a single truth. Valero was out of control, and no one in power was willing to act. For Jennifer, the consequences were brutal and all too real. Each hospital visit testified to her suffering. Each denial from Valero erased her voice. By the spring of 2010, her injuries had become undeniable evidence of abuse that no court wanted to confront head-on. And yet, even with public records piling up, Valero was still walking free, embraced by fans, defended by family, and backed by political power. What happens when you ignore warning signs? When you let fame or politics matter more than accountability? Valero was at the center of a storm, one fueled by violence, ego, and an absolute lack of intervention. Those cracks that had started to show so clearly in 2009 were now impossible to miss. But still, the spiral wasn't over. Jennifer Carolina had survived the fall, but the system had failed her and their family, and the cost of those failures was steep. By the time the incident unfolded, the clock was ticking. Jennifer left the hospital alive on March 25, but her safety was an illusion. This is where the tragedy sharpened into inevitability. The events of March 25 didn't just mark another chapter of abuse. They set a ticking clock in motion. Because from that day forward, every decision, every missed chance at accountability, pushed him further toward a breaking point. And as the final month of his life began, the descent only grew faster. Only now, the stakes had never been higher. Day 24. April 18. The countdown had almost reached its end. Valero checked into a hotel in Valencia with Jennifer by his side. To outsiders, it might have seemed like any other night. But to those who'd been watching closely in the preceding weeks, the prosecutors, the doctors, the family members, it was the moment everyone feared would come. The entire 3-week stretch had been a compressed collapse, a relentless slide that might have been stopped at multiple points, but never was. Each failed intervention allowed Valero to sink deeper into his anger, his addictions, and his violence. By now, he was not only separated from the structure and discipline of boxing, but also freed from any real legal or moral restraint. He lived in a bubble built by enablers, shielded by fame, and ignored by a justice system reluctant to act against one of its idols. And so, within just 24 days, the spiral reached its peak. The same man who once entered arenas as Venezuela's undefeated warrior now carried a storm inside him that was about to erupt in the most horrifying way possible. The next 2 days became the focus of every investigation, every headline, and every haunting question that followed. Late on April 17, 2010, Edwin Valero and his wife checked into a hotel in Valencia. Outwardly, it appeared to be a quiet night, just another evening away from the noise that had followed them for months. But behind that door, something irreversible took place. By morning, the promise of escape had collapsed into one of the most devastating crime scenes Venezuela would ever confront. On the morning of April 18, hotel staff discovered Jennifer's body. She was just 24 years old. The details were stark. 3 stab wounds. No sign of accident. No uncertainty about what had occurred. In an instant, the chaos that had lived in their private life spilled into the public eye, this time leaving marks that could never be hidden. There was no longer speculation, no longer just warning signs. Now there was a body, a crime, and the undeniable truth that tragedy had crossed the final line. According to the federal police chief, Wilmer Flores, Valero himself went down to hotel security that morning and told them outright he had killed his wife. That alleged confession, direct and without provocation, became the central piece of evidence from the very first hours. Whatever the later debate over his state of mind, one fact anchored the case. He had reportedly admitted what happened before anyone else even reached the room. Once authorities were called, investigators secured the hotel. Police combed through the crime scene, documenting bloodstains, broken items, and signs of struggle inside the room. Every clue pointed to violence that was fast and unrelenting. The 3 stab wounds on Jennifer's body left no doubt as to intent. Staff later confirmed hearing arguments earlier in the evening, adding sound to the grim picture the room itself provided. Together, the wounds and the eyewitness accounts painted a consistent narrative of escalating rage. But that wasn't even the worst of it. From hotel to police station, the process moved quickly. Valero was transported to a precinct in Carabobo State. Prosecutors announced they intended to file formal murder charges the very same day. The steps of the legal system, so often slow, moved with unusual speed here, perhaps, because the man they had in custody wasn't just any suspect. He was Venezuela's most famous boxer, a world champion, and a political symbol tied to the government itself. The question wasn't if he would be charged. It was only how long it would take to process the paperwork. Still, even as the case against him solidified, questions began circling. What had pushed him to this breaking point? Was this the culmination of the pattern already visible in the months prior? The arrests, the restraining order, the psychiatric hold, cut short? Or was it something deeper, tied to brain trauma and years of unchecked neurological and emotional issues? Police didn't need to answer those larger questions immediately. They had blood on the walls, a body on the bed, and a confession from the suspect himself. But those wider issues hovered less about proving guilt, more about how a man so publicly unraveling was left unchecked until now. Jennifer's family, who had feared for her safety for months, were devastated but not surprised. They had seen the warnings that went unnoticed, lived through the prior hospitalizations where doctors documented her abuse. For them, the discovery in the hotel room wasn't an isolated shock. It was the end they had been praying would never happen. Their worst fears had finally materialized. Inside a hotel only minutes from their home city, news broke almost immediately across Venezuela. By the afternoon, headlines carried the story nationwide. Edwin Valero, once the undefeated champion with 27 knockouts, was under arrest for murdering his wife. The fall from adored national idol to accused murderer took less than a morning. Fans who had celebrated his knockouts now stared at the stark photographs of police vans and hotel cordons. The aggression they cheered inside the ropes was suddenly exposed as a terror outside of them, now impossible to ignore. For prosecutors, though, the narrative didn't need emotional framing. Their case rested on cold, documented points. A dead body with 3 stab wounds, security staff recounting Valero's words, police evidence from the room, and eyewitness accounts of the couple fighting the night before. That stack of material was enough to move toward charges swiftly. If the process had stretched forward into trial, the confession paired with forensic facts would have left Valero with almost no room for defense. There was, however, one detail that planted seeds of unease in the public mind. After his arrest, Valero was held in a small cell at the local police station. He was cut off from both friends and family, monitored only by the officers on shift. With a man so volatile, with a confession so blunt, a natural question emerged almost immediately. Why was he ever allowed to be alone in custody? Remember this detail. It's important for what's to come, because by nightfall on April 18, the image of Edwin Valero had shifted forever. The perfect knockout record, the tattoos, the Chavez allegiance, all the symbols he had built his public identity around were no longer banners of pride. They were footnotes to a domestic violence case that had finally erupted into the ultimate act of destruction. The world of boxing, stunned and grieving, struggled to reconcile the fighter they had celebrated with the man now in police custody. For Venezuela, it represented not just the collapse of a champion, but the exposure of a deeper truth. The violence everyone had excused in the open had simply crossed a line no one could overlook. And yet, despite everything, the evidence, the confession, the undeniable public fallout, the story was far from over. Less than 24 hours after his arrest, another tragedy would unfold that left even more questions unanswered. Investigators pressed forward, mapping out timelines, verifying the confession, preparing the legal documents. Nothing in the immediate evidence suggested Valero could escape responsibility. By every available measure, the case appeared straightforward. The story had reached its breaking point, but not its conclusion. In the blink of an eye, boxing's most feared knockout artist was no longer a symbol of triumph. He had become something darker, a cautionary tale of unchecked violence, failed intervention, and a system that never acted when it mattered most. And yet, while the chains of due process were just beginning to tighten, the countdown wasn't finished. Less than a day later, Valero's name would return to the headlines again. This time under circumstances that left even more questions hanging over his story. Less than a day after police took him into custody, Edwin Valero was dead. In the early hours of April 19, 2010, guards at the Carabobo police headquarters reported that the undefeated champion had been found hanging in his cell. The official police statement ruled his death a suicide, saying he used threads torn from his clothing to tie a noose to a bar in the cell. Despite efforts by another inmate who discovered him and alerted authorities, Valero was pronounced dead at approximately 1:30 a.m. For officials, that alone closed the case. But behind the official version, doubts and suspicions surfaced almost immediately. The hours leading up to his death added weight to those doubts. After his arrest for the killing of his wife, officers described Valero as agitated and unstable. Just before being escorted to his holding cell, he reportedly spoke words that now read like a final glimpse into his mental state. "I feel so alone. I need to talk to somebody. Don't leave me alone." Those were his last recorded words, according to police reports circulated in the press. For a man long defined by ferocity and dominance, it was a startling confession of emptiness and fear. To some, the statement looked like the warning of a suicide risk. To others, it was the plea of someone desperate not to be left unattended. When news of his death broke, Venezuelan authorities moved quickly to confirm the ruling of suicide. They stated that the body showed no signs of foul play. At the same time, however, they released few specifics. No photographs from inside the cell were made public, and details about guard supervision or how long Valero was left alone were never explained. For a high-profile detainee at the center of a national scandal, the absence of transparency created suspicion. People began asking simple questions. How did a man under constant watch manage to end his own life? Why weren't precautions taken, especially given his mental condition and the chaos of his arrest just hours earlier? The contrast between official certainty and public skepticism grew sharper when people inside his circle voiced their disbelief. His manager, Jose Castillo, openly challenged the report. "He didn't do it. They killed him," Castillo said the day Valero's death was announced. In his eyes, Valero's end was no suicide but an execution carried out under police custody. His blunt accusation gained traction with those already inclined to distrust Venezuelan institutions. Supporters repeated his words as proof that the official story was hiding something darker. Authorities stood firm. To them, the evidence was clear: suicide by hanging. Supporters and his manager claimed otherwise, arguing he had been silenced. The two accounts clashed immediately, each side feeding into Venezuela's deep divisions and political climate. His visible loyalty to Hugo Chavez, with the tattoo emblazoned on his chest, gave conspiracy theories even more room to grow. For some, Valero looked like a liability whose legal case would embarrass the government. For others, his death in custody only fit a pattern of state failures, whether deliberate or negligent. Even without a conspiracy, many wondered if his death pointed to neglect. Suicide may have been possible, but the question remained why he wasn't placed under strict supervision. He was a volatile, high-profile detainee, known for violent outbursts, and arrested less than a day earlier after allegedly admitting to murdering his wife. The system had already shown leniency where restrictions were needed. Now, with his death, the margin for error seemed too wide to ignore. Were the guards negligent? Or had the system never treated him as an ordinary prisoner to begin with? These unanswered questions breathed life into doubts, even among people who did not share Castillo's view of outright murder. What is certain is that his death, like his life, became tangled with politics. The loss of a national sports icon underlined fragile trust in institutions already seen as compromised. For those who believed the official ruling, it was a tragic yet predictable resolution to a man spiraling out of control. For those who rejected it, the story became darker, a symbol of secrets erased behind bars. Either way, the lack of transparency meant the certainty of his death did not extend to the certainty of how it happened. The police presented a clean ending, but the contradictions around supervision, the silence on cell conditions, and the immediate push to declare suicide without wider evidence left holes too obvious to ignore. Instead of resolving the narrative, it simply shifted the focus away from his crimes and into speculation about his last hours. Was this the act of a man consumed by guilt and isolation? Or the silencing of someone whose trial would have dragged powerful figures into unwanted scrutiny? What lingered in the air after April 19 wasn't closure. It was a taut silence filled with uncertainties. Valero's death could be explained plainly, but it could not be separated from the system that housed him, judged him, and then failed to protect him, even from himself. He entered that cell carrying the result of years of violence, trauma, and missed interventions. He left it a corpse, attached to an official ruling many never trusted. The unanswered questions about those final hours only intensified the impact of the tragedy. For his fans, for his critics, and for Venezuela itself, the story of Edwin Valero no longer ended with his perfect record, or even the killing of his wife. It now extended to a jailhouse death that remains unsettled, debated, and doubted. And in the days and years that followed, those doubts would shape how he was mourned, how he was remembered, and how the shadow of his story was carried forward. Because the moment officials declared suicide, the debate didn't stop, it began. And the reaction to his death revealed just as much about the man and the nation that built him into an idol as anything he ever did in the ring. April 19, 2010, did not simply mark the end of Edwin Valero's life. It marked the beginning of a national reckoning. The shock of waking up to the news cut through Venezuela like a thunderclap. Just hours earlier, Valero had been in police custody after allegedly confessing to killing his wife. Now, he was gone, dead, in a cell. For a country that had built him up as an undefeated champion and a symbol of national pride, the aftermath was chaotic. A mix of mourning, disbelief, and suspicion that has never fully quieted. Crowds poured into the streets for his funeral. Thousands of fans turned out, chanting, "Campeón! Campeón!" As if by sheer force of will, they could restore the fighter to the status he once held in their hearts. To outsiders, it looked jarring. The public honoring a man accused of murder, choosing to cling to the myth of the champion, even when the truth of the abuser was now unavoidable. But for many Venezuelans, Valero was more than his crimes. He was their flag bearer, a fighter who carried their struggles into every ring he entered. Reconciling the hero with the man became almost impossible, and the chance reflected the refusal or inability of many to let go of who they thought he was. The highest office in Venezuela weighed in on the tragedy. President Hugo Chavez, who had maintained close ties with Valero, openly lamented the boxer's end. In a televised address, Chavez said, "El Inca never knew defeat in his brilliant boxing career, but he couldn't come to dominate himself. It was part tribute, part caution, and part acknowledgement of a fall so dramatic that even Chavez, who rarely conceded weakness, couldn't ignore it." For Valero's supporters, the president's words were a bittersweet epitaph celebrating the fighter while acknowledging his torment. For critics, it highlighted just how tightly Valero's image had been entangled with politics from the start. But if the tribute showed grief, the questions showed distrust. Almost from the moment of his death, conspiracy theories erupted. The official version, suicide by hanging in a jail cell, satisfied few. In a country where state institutions are often met with suspicion, alternative narratives took root quickly. Some argued Valero had been silenced to prevent a long and embarrassing trial. Others leaned into the political angle, suggesting his loyalty to Chavez or his increasingly unstable behavior made him too much of a liability for those in power. A high-profile death in a police cell, with minimal transparency, was fertile ground for doubt. To this day, the simple question, did he really kill himself? He lingers uneasily alongside the accepted record. Yet the aftermath wasn't just about how he died. It was about how he lived, and the failures that allowed it all to happen. For critics in and outside Venezuela, Valero's spiral raised systemic questions that went far beyond personal tragedy. His case spotlighted a pattern of impunity for celebrities, a justice system too lenient, and a public too eager to cheer violence in the ring while excusing violence at home. Warnings had been everywhere. The 2009 family dispute, the March 25 hospital collapse, the restraining orders ignored, the psychiatric hold abandoned after 9 days. Each one could have been a breaking point. Instead, they became missteps in a countdown nobody halted. The sporting and medical systems faced scrutiny too. Remember, commissions in the United States had already refused to license Valero after a failed MRI in 2004 exposed brain irregularities. It was documented, a matter of record. Yet, instead of pushing for deeper evaluation or long-term care, promoters and commissions simply steered him toward less restrictive jurisdictions, letting his career continue unchecked. Critics called this a wider failure, a willingness to overlook danger for the sake of purses and knockouts. How much of Valero's volatility was linked to untreated brain trauma mixed with addiction was never fully investigated. But the pattern of neglect, medical, legal, and personal, was undeniable. The broader culture around him played its part too. Valero's image had been sculpted into something larger than life. Undefeated, hyper-aggressive, tightly aligned with the political leadership through the Chavez tattoo that stretched across his chest. That aura of invincibility protected him. Every time his temper exploded, every time allegations of abuse surfaced, there was always someone ready to rationalize or excuse it. In the aftermath of his death, Venezuelans were left to wrestle with that question. How much of Edwin Valero was a man, and how much of him was a myth that too many people needed to believe? The story didn't fade quickly. In 2016, 6 years after his death, Valero was thrust back into the spotlight with the release of El Inca, a dramatized film about his rise and fall. For a brief moment, it looked as if Venezuela might finally confront his life on screen, unflinching in its portrayal. Instead, the state intervened. After a short theatrical run, a Venezuelan court ordered the film removed from cinemas and all copies impounded. Officials declared it defamatory, an attack on Valero's image. Director Ignacio Castillo Cautín and his lawyer saw it differently, calling the order a political maneuver. The fight stretched into the Supreme Court, which reinstated the ban, ensuring the film would never gain a proper release. Even in death, Valero's story remained tangled up in political sensitivities, his memory controlled and contested. Moments like this cemented the idea that Valero's legacy had transcended sport. He became a lens through which Venezuela saw itself. A champion and a criminal, a victim and a villain, a national emblem and a national wound. His legacy was as fractured as the man himself. Some continued to chant his name. Others refused to forgive him. But nobody could ignore him. And hanging over it all was the harder question. Did anything change after Edwin Valero? Did boxing rethink how it addresses brain injuries, aggression, or domestic violence among fighters? Did Venezuelan institutions reform the way they protect victims or handle celebrity privilege? From the research available, the answer is sobering. Debate intensified, criticism sharpened, but sweeping reforms are hard to trace. You still see fighters overlooked until disaster strikes, still hear stories of domestic violence brushed aside in the name of talent and profit. Valero's story leaves us with a tension that won't disappear. On one hand, his perfect record stands immortal. 27 fights, 27 knockouts. On the other, the destruction he left at home is just as permanent. In the years since, boxing has celebrated new champions. Venezuela has endured deeper turmoil, and the world has moved forward. Yet, every time Valero's name resurfaces, so do the questions about the systems that failed him, the society that enabled him, and the cost of exalting aggression without accountability. And maybe that's the real reason his death still feels unresolved. It isn't just about what he did or how he died. It's about what everyone else allowed to happen. Which leaves us with one final point to consider. What does Edwin Valero's story really tell us about hero worship, about boxing, and about the consequences of silence when the warning signs are clear? Because that, in the end, is where the story turns from a retelling of one fighter's rise and fall into a mirror held up to all of us. From March 25 to April 19, the countdown was clear. Jennifer's hospitalization, Valero's 9-day release, and the ignored restraining order led directly to the hotel room on April 18 and the jail cell on April 19. In less than a month, oversight failed at every point. Even his death left unanswered questions. Did he take his own life? Or was neglect or worse involved? Why weren't stronger safeguards in place once the danger was obvious? So here's the question for you. Was this preventable? Did leniency or lack of medical oversight cost 2 lives? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to help us keep making content like this for you in the future. See you in the next one.